Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening from wherever you're joining us from. Thank you for joining us on this Voices Africa webinar on youth aspirations. I am very excited to be with you today. My name is Mandipa Ndlovu. I am currently speaking to you from The Hague. I work at Leiden University and I have a passion for African governance as an African myself. I am very excited today to have an esteemed number of panelists with me, and I will get straight into it by asking for opening remarks from Dr. Eunice Mutengi, who is the Senior Director, Acting Research and Learning at the MasterCard Foundation. So Dr. Eunice, please take us away.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are today. A very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us for this really important conversation about Africa's youth. I want to begin by thanking Afrobarometer for this vital partnership, congratulating them on their remarkable Round 10 findings, which are covering 35 countries and representing the voices of millions of young Africans across the continent. The timing of today's conversation and this webinar could not be more relevant, especially in light of the International Youth Day 2025's theme of local youth actions for the SDGs and beyond, a theme that speaks directly to the heart of what we'll be talking about today. Afrobarometer provides the continent's most comprehensive and trusted public opinion data that gives authentic voice to ordinary Africans across 35 countries. And their rigorous methodology, which has been developed over more than 2 decades, with more than 2 decades of experience, and their commitment to scientific excellence really makes them an invaluable partner in understanding what young Africans actually think, want, and need. And today, we're really excited to be here today. I mentioned I'm from the MasterCard Foundation, and where I lead the research and learning team. And we envision a world where every young person has the opportunity to thrive and prosper. We've set out a goal through our Young Africa Work Strategy of enabling 30 million young people across Africa, especially young women, to secure a dignified and fulfilling work by the year 2030. And we believe that research and data will help us towards achieving that goal by advancing our understanding and providing knowledge and insights to inform the strategic and programmatic decision-making and programs that are going to enable young people to access work. And so we're committed to applying the best available evidence on effective approaches to create work opportunities for young people. And so together with partners like Afrobarometer, the panelists who we're going to hear from today, and all of you who are involved in enabling and sort of enabling and helping us towards accelerating progress towards the SDGs and beyond, we feel that today is not just about understanding youth perspectives, it's actually about translating those perspectives into action. So this is a call to action for all of us to join together wherever you're coming from, whatever your part is that you play, to create pathways to opportunities and that can build more inclusive economies and enable young people to shape their own futures. And so as we dive into the findings today, I encourage all of us to listen with open minds, to challenge our assumptions, and commit to actions that will put young Africans at the center of development decisions. So thank you all. Welcome, and really looking forward to hearing from you and to your participation in this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mutengi. And speaking of research and data and best available data, I would like to cross over to Ms. Asafi Gampago from Afrobarometer for her presentation.
Thank you so much, Mandipa, and greetings to you all, ladies and gentlemen. I am very happy to welcome you to this very important conversation on Africa's youth, and I'm going to kick off the conversation by sharing with you some of the highlights of the Afrobarometer data on the priorities, the evaluations, and expectations of Africa's youth. So, as we kick off this conversation, and for the benefit of those of you in the audience who may be unfamiliar with the organization, I'm going to start us off by answering the question, what is Afrobarometer? Afrobarometer is a Pan-African, nonpartisan survey research organization that provides reliable data on African experiences and evaluations on democracy, governance, and quality of life. Why do we do this work? Well, our goal is simple, and that is to give African publics a voice in public policy making processes and decision making more broadly on the African continent. This work started in the year 1999, and to date, we have completed 9 survey rounds in up to 42 countries across the African continent. Around 10 surveys were launched in January of 2024, and they are expected to be completed by the end of this year, 2025. As you know, this webinar is being held in partnership with the MasterCard Foundation. So allow me to say a bit about Afrobarometer's partnership with the MasterCard Foundation. Since the year 2022, the MasterCard Foundation has partnered with Afrobarometer to explore youth issues while strengthening youth capacities on the African continent. And as Dr. Muthengi said, this is anchored on the Foundation's Young Africa Works program, and the strategy is to focus on 3 key priority areas. The first being to generate high quality youth data. The second, to engage policymakers and youth advocates with tangible evidence. And the third being to equip young researchers with the skills to drive pro-youth policies. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this map shows where Afrobarometer works on the continent. As you can see, we have quite a large footprint on the continent. As I said before, we began this work in 1999. We started out in 12 African countries, and since then we have expanded to include up to 42 countries across the continent. So if you look at the map, those highlighted in red is where we first began our work. And then across time, we have expanded into new territory. And the areas highlighted or shaded in gray show where we have not yet expanded into or not yet surveyed. Let's speak a bit now about our methodology. So we use nationally representative samples of adult citizens. So those aged 18 years and above. We speak to voting citizens. We use face-to-face interviews in the language of the respondent's choice. And we also make use of standard questionnaires that allow us to compare across countries and over time. And our sample sizes range from between 1,200 to 2,400 citizens, which yields a country level result with margins of error of between 2 to 3 percentage points. Let's consider now what the key findings are. So what is the Afrobarometer data telling us about young Africans? To start off with, the findings show that African youth, those aged 18 to 35, have more education on average than their elders, but they are also more likely to be unemployed. Aside from the country's general economic conditions and a scarcity of jobs, young people cite a lack of adequate training, a mismatch between educational qualifications and job requirements, and a lack of experience required by employers as their most important barriers to employment. And then, given their choice of jobs, more than half, that is 53% of young Africans would like to start their own business. Next in popularity is working for the government or in the public sector, which is cited by 37% of young respondents. And if the government could increase its spending on programs to help young people, nearly half of all Africans, so not just young people now, but all Africans, that is 48%, believe that job creation should be the highest priority for additional investment. And then health and unemployment are the most important problems that young Africans want their government to address. And lastly, more than half of young Africans, that is 55%, have considered moving to another country at least a little bit, and that is about twice the proportion among those aged 56 years and above. So now let's look at education and employment and dive deeper into what these findings say. As I said, young Africans are on average more educated than their elders. So nearly 7 in 10, that is 68%, have secondary or post-secondary education compared to about 38 to 54% of the older cohorts. What the findings show us is that young Africans are also less likely than their elders to lack formal education altogether. But African youth are considerably more likely than their elders to be out of work and looking for a job. About 4 in 10, that is 42%, are out of work and looking for a job, while 1 in 3, that is 29%, are out of work but have stopped looking for a job altogether. So aside from the country's general economic situation and the scarcity of jobs, young Africans cite a lack of adequate training or preparation, cited by 26%, similar to their elders, and a lack of experience required by employers, cited by 19%, as their most important barriers to employment. About 1 in 7 point to youth's unwillingness to work certain jobs, that's cited by 15%, and a mismatch between educational qualifications and job requirements, again cited by 15%. Only about 1/10, that is 11%, see youth's lack of entrepreneurial skills or motivation as a barrier to youth employment. In countries like Sao Tome and Principe, in Cape Verde, in Congo-Brazzaville, in Liberia and Senegal, about 4 in 10 young adults cite the lack of adequate training or preparation as the most important barriers to economic opportunity. And given their choice of jobs, more than half, that is 53% of African youth, would like to start their own businesses. Next in popularity is working for the government or in the public sector, and that's cited by 37% of youth. About 1 in 10, and that is 12%, say they would work for a private company or business, and less than 1/10, that is 6%, would work for a non-governmental organization or NGO. So the desire to start one's own business is shared by more than 2/3 of young people in countries like Benin, cited by 68% of young people, the Gambia, cited by 69% of young people, and in Senegal, cited by 74% of young people. But fewer than 3 in 10 young adults have a desire to start their own businesses in countries like Angola, cited by only 27%, Mauritius, cited by 26% of young people, and in Namibia, cited by just 19% of young people. Let's turn now to discuss youth priorities. So in our questionnaire, we ask our respondents if the government could increase spending to help youth, which areas should they prioritize? And on this question, we found that nearly half of all Africans, that is 48%, believe that job creation should be the highest priority for additional investment. Job creation is followed by education, which is cited by 16% of respondents. Jobs training is cited by 14%. Access to business loans is cited by 13%. And social services for youth is cited by 8%. In countries like Cote d'Ivoire, in Lesotho, in Congo-Brazzaville, in Gabon, in Morocco, and in Ghana, more than 6 in 10 young people see job creation as a priority for additional spending to help youth. In countries like Malawi and the Seychelles, on the other hand, just about a quarter of young adults prioritize job creation. And what are the most important problems that young people believe their government should address? When we ask this question, we find that health tops the list of most important problems that young people want their government to address, cited by 37%. But this is followed very closely by unemployment, cited by 36% of young people. The increasing cost of living, cited by 24%, follows unemployment, and then from that follows on education, cited by 24%, and infrastructure and roads, cited by 23%. On these priority areas that I've just highlighted, young people offer very mixed reviews of their government's performance, ranging from strikingly low levels of approval on keeping prices stable, which gains only 17% approval, and creating jobs, which gains only 23% approval, to about half of approval on addressing educational needs, which stands at 51%, pardon me, improving basic health services, 45%, and maintaining roads and bridges, also at 45%. And youth's approval ratings are very similar to those of older citizens, as we can see from the graph. Let's move on now to look at youth's views on their country's economic conditions. And what we find is that only a quarter of young adults, that is 25%, think that their country's economic conditions are better now than a year ago. But about double that proportion, that is 49%, think things will get better during the coming year. And also, what we note from the graph is that youth are slightly more optimistic about future economic conditions than their elders. Let's turn now to look at immigration. We asked our respondents how much if at all, they have considered moving to another country to live. And on this question, the findings show that more than half of young Africans, that is 55%, have considered moving to another country at least a little bit. And that is about twice the proportion among those who are aged 56 years and above. More than 7 in 10 young Africans in countries like Mauritius, Ghana, the Gambia, Sao Tome and Principe, Cape Verde, and Liberia have considered moving to another country at least a little bit. On the other hand, if we look at the bottom of the graph, only about 1 in 10 Tanzanian youth, that is 12%, have given it a thought. Let's consider now what the reasons are for immigration. More than half of young Africans, that is 52%, who have considered leaving their country, say the most important reason that would make them move is to find work or better job opportunities, while more than 1/4, that is 27%, cite escaping economic hardship or poverty. And what is the preferred destination for potential immigrants? From the findings, we see that the most preferred destinations for potential young African migrants are North America, that is the US and Canada, cited by 33%, and Europe follows, cited by 31% of young Africans. About 2 in 10 say they would move to another country within their region, cited by 16%, or elsewhere in Africa, cited by 5%. Let's talk now about youth's views on governance. So just like their elders, the findings show that young Africans want democracy. More than 6 in 10 of youth, that is 63%, say that they prefer democracy to any other kind of government. But only about 4 in 10, that is 38%, express satisfaction with the way that democracy is working in their country. Young Africans are more likely than their elders to express willingness to tolerate military intervention when elected leaders abuse power. The findings show that almost 6 in 10, that is 57% of young people, say that the armed forces should intervene in a country's political processes when elected leaders abuse power or use it for their own ends. And lastly, let's look at political participation. African youth are less likely, on average, than older generations to engage in a variety of political and civic activities, with the exception of protest and social media activism. So we see that young people are significantly less likely than their elders to say, for instance, that they voted in a previous election. And when it comes to contacting leaders and institutions, young Africans are less likely than their elders to say they contacted a traditional leader, a political party official, or a member of parliament during the past year. And as I close, I want to stress that the data that I've just presented to you does not reflect the views of the MasterCard Foundation or Afrobarometer's funders. Instead, It reflects the views of Africans that we interviewed across the continent on issues that pertain to their lives and their livelihood. Thank you all for your attention. And Mandipo, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Asafika. There is a lot to digest and a lot to be angry about, but also a lot of opportunities that I see in the data that you presented. So thank you very much. I would like to point everyone to the fact that there is translation available. If you fiddle around with your toggles, you will find that there is English to French and French to English translation. And please, as we are having this conversation, I urge each and every one of you to hop onto social media, tag Afrobarometer, tag the MasterCard Foundation, and use the hashtag Voices Africa. That is hashtag Voices Africa to tell us what you think about these conversations, double down on the data that has been presented in these conversations, something that stands out to you, something that one of our brilliant panelists has said. We would really like to hear from you. I am going to go directly into this panel discussion. I think we have kept our brilliant panelists waiting for far too long. And I am going to start with Ms. Bupe Lujano Kabaje, who is the founder of the Abana Africa Foundation. And I'm going to go straight into it. I'm going to ask you, some of the data that was just presented to us reflected that over 53%, well, 53%, over half of African youth aged between 18 to 35 say that they would prefer to start their own business if they could choose any job sector. As someone that is engaged in the entrepreneurial space, I would like to ask you, are we romanticizing the entrepreneurial journey in Africa, given that unemployment is such a crisis? And what does this strong entrepreneurial drive tell us about youth aspirations and the current state of formal employment systems?
Thank you so much for that question, Mandeepa. I think the biggest thing is, as the data clearly showed, is there's this mismatch between youth aspirations and the realities of formal employment. Because you find that with formal employment, there's like a limited number of employment spaces, low quality of job according to young people. And then there's also this poor alignment between the skills that young people have versus the ambitions that they have. So young people nowadays want a job that offers them autonomy, flexibility, and also the chance to innovate and create impact. So in as much as there's a certain level of romanticizing of entrepreneurship, I think the aspiration behind it is really valid because these young people are looking for a chance to be able to create and to innovate. And in this generation Gen Z era, young people want to make money. And so when they look at government jobs, they're like, this is not going to give me enough money. So young people want to instead create something for themselves and then be able to get money out of that. And then regarding the ecosystem, I think what it shows us is that there's pockets of progress, but there still remains uneven because we've seen digital finance improving with mobile money expanding all through Africa. That's really increasing the opportunities for young people because there's more financial inclusion, but there's still less access to capital. So you'll find that even in as much as young people want to get into entrepreneurship, the biggest challenge that they face is access to capital and also the market linkages. So you'll find that even though young people do end up succeeding within their entrepreneurial journeys, they always tend to just end up being in the micro business space rather than getting to the small, medium enterprise. So that is a big challenge for young people. And regarding in essence, youth aspirations just reflect this desire for agency and innovation. And I think this is something that should continue to be encouraged in young people. But the structural gap that exists within our different African countries, where there's a limitation of jobs and there's this mismatch between skills and the job market, that gap definitely needs to be filled, and governments and the private actors have yet to bridge this gap. And I think this is where civil society and development partners come in.
For sure. But I mean, society and development partners can only act with the knowledge that they have available. And this is why the data is important, both from the technical side, but also the perception side, from the citizen perception side, which is what we're discussing today. In your opinion, what are the kind of education skills and investments as a technocrat, as someone that's involved on the ground, what kind of skills and investments are needed to meaningfully meet these expectations? And are we making progress? I mean, we are talking about job creation and education being some of the top youth priorities for preferences for increased government investment here.
The biggest investment can be made in practical life and employability skills. And what I mean by that is entrepreneurial leadership skills. And this is something that we try to do at Havana Africa, because the biggest gap I identified is that young people go to university, they'll study some of the hardest subjects, but then once they're done with that, they go into the real world. These young people can barely write a CV for themselves, even do a presentation, because these are the skills that are not being taught in school. While they're in school, all they're learning is how do you, if somebody studied engineering, they're primarily focused in that engineering space. And when it comes to it and they're out in this field, they can barely sell themselves or even create presentations. So what needs to be done is there needs to be this shift within schools where we're just not learning the technical side of whatever subject area, but we're learning what does it mean to have presentation skills, to be able to communicate in school as a young person. What does it mean to have a personal brand and to be able to articulate that to people? So with a focus on that personal development and entrepreneurship, that being embedded into the curriculum will really help young people to come out of it, because that way they are able to even sell themselves beyond the technical skills that they have. So there really needs to be that focus on that side of personal development as well as entrepreneurial leadership. And then to answer the question on the progress that is being made, I think the progress is visible, and you can see it in certain areas where you now have training institutions in different communities. One of them being like with Havana Africa, we do help these young people. There's other organizations within Zambia and abroad as well, where young people are being mentored and young people are also developing these innovation skills and training so that they can be able to progress not just in their technical career but also outside. And so to be able to meet these expectations that young people have for government to be able to back them when it comes to personal development, I think at the end of the day, there's still more to be done. I think both the government, development partners, as well as civil society, really need to look at how do we transform or reform education, rather from just it being technical to it being more personal development, entrepreneurial, so that young people can be problem solvers. They can be autodidactic in things that they're doing, rather than them just being this technocrats and not being able to know how to articulate themselves. So I think that we still have a little bit more to do in terms of the ecosystem and investing in that educational transformation.
We absolutely do. And one of the things that really comes to mind for me is leveraging regional expertise. Not one country, not one system has all of the answers. And hopefully countries like yourself and myself can put aside Victoria Falls politics and work together in strengthening that skills gap and fostering that. Thank you so much. I'm going to have a conversation briefly around the micro level of these of what we were speaking about, of these aspirations, about this investment, about the ecosystem, and really double down on training. Monsieur Arame Sen, are you with us? Can you hear us? Arame? Okay, Arame may have dropped off. We are hoping he will join us soon, but okay, I'm getting feed that he is on, that he is here. Monsieur, could you unmute yourself so we could have a conversation around your work being done at the Social Change Factory and what we can be doing at a granular level? Fantastic. Can you hear us? Okay, I think we've lost him. We're going to try and stabilize that connection. And I'm going to cross over to Baba Abdullahi Machina, who is the Community Engagement Manager for Spotlight and for Transparency at the Accountability Initiative. We've been speaking about skills. We've been speaking about aspirations and how those skills need to be done. But I honestly think there is something to be said about us having an honest conversation about the capacity our governments and our institutions may or may not have regarding job creation. So from the data that was presented to us, only 25% of young people seem to think that the government is doing a good job. How do you feel about that? Is that a true indication based on the work that you do? Let's be honest here. I love to say that, you know, the best place to be honest is at home. We're all at home here. We're all Africans on here. It's African to African. What can be done? And are we being honest about the capacity, for instance, for the TIVET training centers that are coming through as some of the solutions to the unemployment that we see in Africa? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And first of all, let me say I feel very privileged to be part of this female-dominated panel. I will try in as much as I can not to be outnumbered too quickly.
The technical term is a WANL.
All right. Thank you so much for this important question. And I think I'm happy that you say very honest conversations and think we are Africans and we need to tell ourselves the truth. And this conversation is timely and the question is very, very important that we shouldn't overlook it. We need to discuss the very honest what is the capacity of the government to provide or not to provide jobs. First of all, we do know that anywhere throughout the history, government cannot be a sole employer of a job. What government should do is to provide an enabling environment for private investment and other sector to strive. And that is how job is being created anywhere. We have seen how China lifted more than 700 million people out of poverty in 3 decades. That is 30 years. And this is something that can be doable in Africa, in any other country in Africa, in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Senegal, and any other country. We can do that. But we need to have a very honest conversation. What is the capacity of our government to provide job for everyone? We all know that government cannot provide job for you and I, but all what government should do is to provide an enabling environment for the private sector to strive. And that is where the job will be created. Now, we talk about 25% of the youths feel that they are doing job. So now, where is the job in the market. We need to go back to a very honest conversation again that what is the qualification of these young people across the country or across the African continent? And what are the skills that is required by the industry? Is it in possession of these young people? It's not. And how are you going to provide jobs to these teeming youth? And we all know that government cannot do that. So I think we need to have a very honest conversation, to be honest. We are Africans, we know that government is weak, governance is weak in Africa. We all know that there are corruption, there are a lot of inefficiency when it comes to government. But what we do normally in our own organization, how are you going to provide, how are you going to empower the citizens to demand accountability, to ensure that there is transparency, there is accountability in governance? Therefore, we continue to engage community leaders, traditional leaders, and even the government themselves. Look, you are being elected into a particular position to provide essential services. But this is not what is being done. This is not what we have been seeing. Mind you, Nigeria is one of the largest countries in terms of the youth, about I think 70% of the young people, the entire population of the country, Nigeria, 232 millions. And out of these 232 millions Nigeria, 70% of the population are young people below the age of 30. And this is time bomb. And these people don't have job. These people are roaming the streets. They came out of the university with obsolete education. They don't know where to go. So who is going to create the job for these people? It's not the government, you and I know, but it's the private sector. Where are the security? Where are the infrastructure? Where are the electricity that will attract private investors from America, from UK to come and establish their industry and also create job for this teaming youth?
I think,
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, but I have to push you a little bit here. You know, I think sometimes when we present issues to our government as youth issues, they're not taken as seriously as they should. When we speak about the time bomb, that we're expecting to erupt or to go off at any minute, it's not just a youth issue, you know, though bad governance is not just a youth issue, you know. So how are we thinking about a holistic societal way of engaging our governments, not just at the youth level, but at a societal level, to the point where we capacitate communities, and that has a ripple effect on how our youth are trained, are employed, are have access to water, have reliable electricity supply, you know, and all of this affects civic trust and political engagement amongst youth, because we also know that voter apathy is at an all-time low on the continent. So let's maybe step away from the youth lens and think about how governance could work for all and how it could be packaged so that it affects the most poignant part of the population.
Yes, thank you so much. I think this is democracy we are practicing. Of course, even though for me, as a student of political science, I don't believe that in Africa we are practicing democracy or we are practicing anything closer to democracy. That is not what is obtainable in Africa. What we are practicing is something else that we are yet to define what we are practicing. But essential democracy, the essence of democracy is to provide essential services. If democracy cannot provide job for me, democracy cannot provide education, democracy cannot provide potable drinking water, democracy cannot give me opportunity, then what is the essence of democracy? Why shouldn't I support anybody, even if it is military administration, to come and take over? Because I haven't seen any improvement in my standard of living. And even the young people across the country are complaining. We have been complaining that the government doesn't have the capacity to deliver. And why is it that we're electing these people into office every 4 years, for example, in Nigeria? And after these 4 years, what are they, what are the indicators? What are they, have they improved education or access to education? Have they improved, access to opportunity? They are not doing that. So now, that is why both of the young people are more inclined to military intervention. Not because we want the military or the military is the best option. Democracy is the best option. We all know that. Even from that finding of Afrobarometer shows that the young people are too much inclined or they support democracy. But the problem is they said now, if the leaders abuse power, then military should take over. It means something wrong. So now we need to go to drawing board. Who are those leaders that were elected into particular office? Do they even understand what are the yearning and aspiration of the young people? Not even the young people. Democracy should be inclusive. The vulnerable people, the age group, the elderly, the women, and even the community, whatever community, for example, these people should be included and should be carried along. And that is inclusive governance, and that is inclusive democracy. In the absence of that, then I don't think we are ready to fix democracy or we are ready to fix governance in our country within the African continent. And again, I want to say that we have issue around lack of quality leadership. Those people who are in power today in every part of Africa they don't have the interest of the masses at heart. These people are there to capture the power and then serve their own interest. Remember that these people went to the polling booth, these people went to campaign in our respective communities and said, oh, you know what? I will provide water for you. I will give you education. I will protect you. I will give you security. And then maybe after the election has already ended, you won the election, you go to Abuja, you go to, anywhere, and then that is just the end of it. You will not come back until after 4 years. You now come back and give them money. So one, we need to create awareness among these young people. Let them understand that why are you electing these people into particular office? What is the reason? And people should also present their own, policies. We need to criticize, evaluate, and understand policies of our political candidate before we even decided to say we are going to support them. If we didn't do that, then in turn, what we are now experiencing is failure in governance.
Absolutely. And that's a brilliant segue. I will now cross over to Irma Maringo, who's the head of programs at the Africa Youth Trust. Irma, are you with us? Fantastic. Please unmute yourself. I mean, we've just been speaking about leaders not having the interests of the people at heart. And one of the major drivers of change in recent years has been digital media as a space for activism for young people. How can this be converted into sustained civic or policy engagement?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This is a timely conversation, just as we have been reflecting during the International Youth Day, to speak to what does digital activism look like for young people. So I do see the uptake of digital media being converted into sustainable civic and policy engagement. And we have evidence of this happening. We can see that the digital platforms have become more so a training ground for young people's civic engagement. This is where the young people first experiment with raising their voices, finding communities of solidarity, and challenging authorities. Now, the critical question is whether these actions remain momentary or whether they translate into long-term change. We have seen this across the continent. For instance, in Nigeria, the hashtag #EndSARS protests began as a hashtag, then grew into mass action that birthed civic groups advocating for police reform. Closer home to Kenya, the hashtag #RejectFinance bill showed how digital mobilization could spill into the streets, force government concessions, and even push young people to propose alternative budgets, sorry. In Senegal, there's a hip hop group, the Yena Mer, transformed this movement into over a decade of youth-driven civic education and election monitoring and so on. Even in South Africa, the hashtag Fees Must Fall, we can see this continuing to shape higher education policies. So these are not isolated protests. They are proof that digital action can be converted into sustained civic engagement. But it would be dishonest not to acknowledge the challenges and the threats. We've seen that online spaces are not neutral. Some young activists have faced harassment, trolling, cyber surveillance, and deliberate disinformation campaigns. We've also seen how governments resort to internet shutdowns to silence youth voices, and so on. So the question is, how do we convert this energy into long-term civic participation? I see three opportunities. So one being recognition. We must begin by recognizing that digital action is legitimate civic engagement. Attending hashtag is not the end of the story. It often is the beginning. We also need to be intentional with the efforts to link online mobilization with offline policymaking. So this can be through youth consultations, civic tech platforms that track government responses, or legal reforms that create feedback loops. And finally, protection. We must ensure that young people can engage safely, both online and offline. This means that through digital literacy to counter misinformation, legal safeguards for expression, and more so psychosocial support for activists. So I believe that youth are not waiting to be invited to democracy. They are already redefining it through digital spaces, through culture, through community. So the responsibility of governments and institutions is to meet them halfway.
I love that last point on psychosocial protections, because just 15% of young people say that they've joined requests for call to action from their governments in the past year. Does this level of apathy surprise you, given these structural and psychological barriers that actually exist? And this is heightened, obviously, during election times. And less so otherwise. But instances of organized violence and torture have become infinitely more scary because of the level of surveillance. So does this shock you, this level of apathy, very quickly?
When we look at the Afrobarometer data, the first instinct is to assume apathy. But for me, I would rather term it as disillusionment. We can see young people engaging, but often outside the traditional spaces where their voices feel ignored or co-opted. They're on the streets, they're in the arts, they're on social media and community movements. But when the formal systems are unresponsive, youth often don't see the point of joining petitions or government requests for input. So when we look into the structural barriers, we can see limited channels for feedback. So suppose a government or a community decides to have a public participation. We oftentimes see that some of those feedback mechanisms are not being strengthened, and they don't see their input being included into these processes. One thing that the young people also face is the tokenistic approaches to consultations. We've seen it as a way of ticking a box. So it sort of means that it's just an avenue to fill up a need rather than a want. We've also seen the weak protection of civic spaces. And how fragile the ecospace has been for youth activists and youth within the civil society organizations that try to hold governments to account. And so in some cases, we've seen that to be outright repression. When we look into the psychological factors, the young people feel ignored, they feel dismissed, which leads to frustration and more so cynicism as to what's the point to contribute, what's the point of involving ourselves in processes that we feel we're not wanted. So the fact that youth continue to mobilize in less formal spaces shows that they are not necessarily apathetic. They're simply seeking alternative platforms where their voices matter. So the opportunity lies in rethinking engagement. So if governments and institutions can create safe, credible, and responsive mechanisms, then disillusionment can be transformed into constructive participation.
Absolutely. And, one of the questions is then, this is a rhetorical one. It's, thinking through whether, I think for our own safety, it has to be a rhetorical one. Thinking through whether it is in government's best interest to rethink that engagement. But maybe it's framed that way, so that the ticking time bomb that was mentioned earlier is addressed sooner. I'm going to check one more time. Is Arame on the call with us? Can you hear us? Okay, I think we've lost him. No worries. I'm going to link.
Oui, je suis là. Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Ah, parfait, parfait. Would you mind
Vous m'entendez?
you what? Your mic is on.
Ok, super.
Fantastic. Please, could we have your camera on so that we can see you, s'il vous plaît?
Ok. Est-ce que vous
Fantastic.
voyez?
Merci. So, Agame, one of the things that has been spoken about, other than a mismatch of youth aspirations and skills, has been these psychological barriers that are amplified on social media, on the digital platform. But these real life issues exist, and they're being ignored or dismissed. In countries like Tunisia and Eswatini, over 30% of youth specifically lack training as a major obstacle to finding employment. And clearly the strategies that are available have not worked in bridging the skills to experience gap. Again, 26% of youth aged 18 to 35, actually this stat extends all the way to people aged 55, across 35 African countries that Afrobarometer surveys, cited a lack of adequate training or preparation as a top economic barrier to employment. And another 19% cited a lack of experience, and 15% cited this mismatch that we were speaking about. Why do these barriers exist? And why do they persist despite increasing educational attainment? Where are we missing the mark?
Merci beaucoup pour cette question. Je vous remercie également pour cette invitation. Je pense que c'est une question ou des questions qui, depuis longtemps, subsistent. Donc, du coup, excusez-moi. Voilà. Donc, du coup, pour répondre à cette question, en effet, dans ces pays-là, l'Eswatini, la Tunisie et dans bien d'autres pays africains, il y a encore cette question de la formation qui subsiste. Pourquoi? Parce que je pense qu'on est aujourd'hui dans nos États encore très attachés à des façons de faire qui sont plutôt et encore, qui sont encore et aujourd'hui très traditionnelles. Et pourtant, le constat, il est là. Aujourd'hui, les jeunes sont plus éduqués, ont plus accès à l'éducation que leurs anciens. La question, en fait, moi, comme première réponse, je dirais tout simplement, pour essayer de rester vraiment dans une centralisation jeunesse, c'est que aujourd'hui, les formations ne sont pas, ne sont pas abordées dans le sens de la dans le sens de la co-création, dans le sens de la co-construction. Aujourd'hui, nous avons beaucoup d'études, comme celui d'Afrobarometer. Nous avons beaucoup de données qui sont mis à disposition, où les jeunes eux-mêmes disent ce dont ils ont besoin, où les jeunes eux-mêmes font part de ce dont ils ont besoin. Mais malheureusement, dans la pratique, on va se rendre compte que les propositions qui sont faites en termes de formation, justement, dans la pratique, ne prennent pas en compte justement ces besoins des jeunes-là. Et je pense qu'il est important aujourd'hui d'aller dans un sens où les jeunes ne sont plus juste des bénéficiaires, mais les jeunes qui sont acteurs, acteurs de leur avenir, acteurs de leur formation. Et il importe dans ce sens-là de pouvoir vraiment penser à des approches où les jeunes ne sont pas juste des gens à qui on demande oui, venez à de la formation, allez-y, alors que cela ne répond pas justement à eux, leurs besoins. Mais au-delà de ça aussi, aux besoins du marché. Vous l'avez dit tout à l'heure, aujourd'hui, il y a une inadéquation entre la formation et l'emploi. Dans nos universités au Sénégal, par exemple, on a plus des formations que je pourrais qualifier de classiques, qui fait qu'une fois que les jeunes sont en fin de cursus, une fois que les jeunes ont leur diplôme, leur licence, leur master, ils ont du mal à trouver des opportunités. Et pourtant, souvent, j'ai envie de dire que ce ne sont pas les opportunités qui manquent, tout simplement parce que le marché est là. Il y a énormément de secteurs qui sont en croissance, le secteur du numérique, de l'IA, entre autres. Mais malheureusement, il n'y a pas des offres pratiques qui font que ces jeunes-là puissent tout simplement s'insérer dans le cadre de leur formation. Et je pense qu'il serait vraiment bien pour nos États de repenser ça, de remettre les jeunes au cœur des formations qui sont proposées pour ne pas finalement se retrouver avec des jeunes qui sont formés mais qui ne s'identifient pas justement à ce qui est là, à l'offre qui est là, d'essayer tout simplement d'adapter les formations à la demande du marché afin de permettre aux jeunes aussi de pouvoir, une fois leurs études finies, en tout cas leur formation finie, de pouvoir avoir accès à un emploi digne et décent, mais également d'explorer d'autres formes tout simplement d'apprentissage. Pour moi, aujourd'hui, il est important d'aller vers de plus en plus un apprentissage plus pratique. Un apprentissage plus pratique qui fait que les jeunes peuvent, au cours de leur cursus, avoir accès à des stages, avoir accès à... Et ça, ce qui va le permettre, c'est plutôt des partenariats entre le public et le privé, entre les écoles et les entreprises, aller dans des systèmes d'alternance qui sont bien sûr expérimentés dans certains pays et qui montrent aussi l'efficacité de cela. Et au-delà de ça, j'ai envie de dire aussi que ce qui fait que ce problème-là subsiste aujourd'hui, c'est parce que dans nos enseignements, on n'a pas dans nos formations, on n'a pas cette capacité-là de nous recréer, tout simplement, de nous recréer dans le sens où il y a beaucoup de compétences dans la formation qui ne sont pas prises en compte. Je pense je pense à tout ce qui est soft skills, donc tout ce qui est relatif aux compétences douces, qui ne sont pas du tout prises en compte dans nos curricula qui sont plutôt classiques. Et aujourd'hui, dans nos organisations, malheureusement aussi, nous expérimentons des façons de faire, des formations plutôt innovantes qui permettent aux jeunes de pouvoir être pris dans le processus, de pouvoir s'identifier au métier du marché et de pouvoir saisir pleinement des opportunités. Mais souvent aussi, il y a le problème des financements. Nous expérimentons, mais malheureusement, il y a des financements qui, sur le temps, ne durent pas et qui ne nous permettent pas justement de capitaliser sur ça et de permettre à ces jeunes-là de pouvoir profiter aussi de ces approches, de ces méthodologies qui répondent. Et pour finir, hein, juste dire que ce serait vraiment bénéfique pour nos États de pouvoir expérimenter ces nouvelles façons de faire, de permettre aux jeunes aussi de pouvoir allier compétences techniques, mais aussi compétences douces. Aujourd'hui, nous, dans nos organisations, par exemple, on donne des opportunités à des jeunes de réaliser ce qu'on appelle des volontariats de service civique qui permettent à ces jeunes-là diplômés de voyager à l'extérieur, d'avoir des expériences professionnelles au sein d'organisations pendant 6 mois, pendant 12 mois. Et voilà, c'est vraiment des approches intéressantes qu'il faudrait explorer.
Abs Absolutely. You know, I wonder though, this is going to be a very brief intervention and brief exchange between us, but I wonder there's this huge push, and you mention it as well, um, towards technical and vocational education and training in Africa being a strong factor for economic growth on the continent. But nobody talks about the challenges. So the challenges to structuring informal vocational training, the guarantees or not of these technical trainings being inclusive for vulnerable groups, strengthening education and vocational training and the employment continuum. Nobody is talking about all of these and whether these are actually skills that the private sector, which is one of the biggest employers for long-term and funding and development, whether these are the skills that are actually needed. Is this another way to escape the challenge by throwing another policy and another initiative at the problem?
Mhm. Ouais, donc si je comprends bien, c'est le renforcement technique et professionnel et les autres types de renforcement, c'est ça.
The professional training? Sorry, I did not get the question.
Donc, oui, je pense que il est important d'intégrer ce renforcement technique et professionnel-là parce que les entreprises en ont besoin, c'est la base. Après, pour nous, principalement, je vais donner l'exemple de Social Charge Factory, nous insistons beaucoup au-delà des compétences techniques professionnelles, donc nous insistons beaucoup sur les compétences douces. Donc, tout ce qui est en rapport avec les soft skills, tout ce qui est en rapport avec des approches expérientielles. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, dans les universités, dans les écoles de formation, avec les programmes mis en place par l'État, les jeunes sont formés, on n'en doute pas, les jeunes acquièrent peut-être des compétences techniques, mais le problème, c'est que ces jeunes-là, ils ont du mal justement à pouvoir, une fois en entreprise, euh, disons, transcrire ces expériences techniques-là, ces expériences professionnelles-là de façon donc très, très, très concrète. Et donc, c'est là maintenant qu'il est important, et comme je le disais tout à l'heure, d'insister vraiment sur cette autre dimension-là, psychosociale, cette autre dimension-là, compétences douces, pour permettre à ces jeunes-là de pouvoir aussi disposer des compétences qui leur permettent, une fois en entreprise, de pouvoir répondre aux besoins aussi de l'entreprise. Parce que les entreprises aussi ne vont pas recruter des jeunes juste parce que voilà, ils ont fini une formation, mais c'est parce que eux aussi, il faut qu'ils puissent justement voir leur intérêt par rapport aux jeunes, ce qu'il va faire une fois donc sur place. Alors, il est important donc dans ce sens-là de pouvoir accompagner les jeunes, de pouvoir essayer de trouver des mécanismes qui permettront dans nos systèmes d'intégrer justement des modules, voilà, des modules sur pourquoi pas le leadership, des modules sur pourquoi pas la communication, des modules pourquoi pas sur les attitudes professionnelles. Et ce sont des choses comme ça qui vont véritablement faciliter aux jeunes, disons, leur insertion. Juste pour donner un exemple, en Côte d'Ivoire, par
Merci.
exemple, on a lancé un programme qui s'appelle le Voix des jeunes jobs, où ce sont des jeunes étudiants, c'est des jeunes qui sont en apprentissage, en formation, qui sont accompagnés dans plusieurs modules qui leur permettent, au-delà vraiment de leurs compétences techniques, de leurs compétences professionnelles, de pouvoir savoir comment chercher un emploi, comment préparer un entretien, comment se comporter en entreprise, etc. Et pour valoriser ça, par exemple, on a essayé d'en faire une télé-réalité. afin aussi de permettre à d'autres jeunes de voir un peu comment ça se fait et de pouvoir
Merci.
justement aller
Ouais,
dans ce sens de mieux prendre en compte ces types de compétences-là. Donc,
ouais,
en effet, pour moi, je pense qu'il est important,
ouais.
au-delà des compétences techniques professionnelles, que l'on puisse voir et formaliser ça, même dans nos États, je trouve, hein, vraiment de trouver, essayer de voir comment insérer des types d'approches qui permettront de véritablement prendre en compte cette dimension psychosociale-là, cette dimension compétences, tout cela, et au travers
Merci.
vraiment de plusieurs
Merci.
approches. Moi, je pense au volontariat, le service à la communauté, ce sont vraiment des choses que nous expérimentons et qui peuvent énormément donc aider.
Merci. Thank you so much for your interventions. Merci beaucoup. Okay, fantastic. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go straight into our Q&A session. If there are any questions, I encourage you to write them in the chat, and we will attend to them. While you are still rounding up those questions, I will take 3 questions. I see 2 currently. I will wait for one more. I will wait for one more question. I will turn very briefly to our esteemed Afrobarometer presenter. Ms. Mbako, you have heard all of this, right? How should data on youth aspirations be positioned to shape national development agendas, given these pressing challenges and downward macro trends like we've seen in recent reports like the World Bank's Global Economic Prospects report?
Thanks, Mandipa. I want to start off by saying that I think that the Afrobarometer data is important in that it helps us to identify the problems and it can help serve as a guiding framework for developing national development agendas. And this is in large part why Afrobarometer was founded, to add to the repository of knowledge and evidence on African realities. And so I think that in contexts or in countries where growth is slowing and where unemployment is rising, it's important for policymakers to know what young people expect, what they value, and what they demand in order to design policies that are effective and that will be relevant and sustainable in the long term. So I think that if young people are saying that unemployment and the rising cost of living is among their top 3 concerns, then development plans need to reflect that. They need to prioritize job creation and skills development, and that could potentially be focused on emerging sectors like agribusiness and digital technology, maybe even renewable technology as we head into the Africa Climate Conference that will be happening, in Addis. So we need to think through these things with the evidence that we have. And I also think that it's important that we reframe how we think about young people. We tend to see young people as just a vulnerable group, but if we understand that young people have skills, that they have the creativity and the drive to add to building their economies, then we can see them as agents of change and as partners in actually driving economic transformation. And then lastly, I want to end with the question, what is the cost? If we choose to ignore young people's concerns and we continue to relegate them to the margins of society, what will become of this continent? What will the cost be? We've already seen that there are risks when it comes to political stability, and there are also migration pressures that emerge from ignoring young people. And so I would caution against doing that because we've seen that the repercussions and the consequences are great.
Absolutely. What is the cost? The cost benefit analysis really lies in what we want our future to look like as a continent. There is an intervention from Peter Pinar. I'm not sure where Peter is typing from or which country perspective Peter's looking in from. But Peter says, looking at the figures on the desire to pursue one's own business, countries on the lower end have more government intervention in the economy, for instance, Namibia and Angola. While the private sector is important, in some cases, our governments just privatizing their economic planning responsibilities to individuals? Okay. Moreover, we know from neoliberal economies, there is a high possibility of inequality flourishing when governments retreat. This is accentuated by the realities that starting rather a business is much easier for those that already have resources. Does this spell problems for inequality in the long term? There are a lot of questions in this. Does anything jump out at any one of our panelists that is willing to tackle even a part of this? So I'm hearing privatization. I am seeing the difference between the haves and the have-nots, inequality in the long term, resource allocation. What does that look like? Anybody?
I can tackle the question on,
Absolutely.
are
Please.
are you able to hear me? Okay,
Yes,
go.
we can hear you clearly.
The question on starting a business being much easier for those who already have resources, I think that goes unsaid. And this is just not the financial resources, but what you also find is in a lot of African countries, it's also about the networks that you're connected with. So it would be much easier for you to start a business if you not only have the capital, but are also connected within the industry or the sector that you're starting this business, because there's the regulation side of things, there's the who you know who's going to talk to somebody on your behalf. So all of those factors do influence somebody starting a business, as well as how the business will grow or prosper over the years. So yeah, it is a very big part of it, I think.
Absolutely. Can I ask someone to tackle the question on privatizing economic responsibilities to individuals? Baba, can I ask you to tackle that one?
Okay. Okay, you talk about
The question is, while the private sector is important, in some cases, there is a question around whether governments are just privatizing their economic planning responsibilities to individuals. So the privatization of these services. That
sure.
is going to be
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's true that in most cases in Africa, the privatization process is more of individuals than people who are interested into that particular sector of the economy. And this is because government is very weak. People are not holding to accountable, and all those are the problems that compounded within the framework of policy implementation, especially in African country. The governance is weak. Privatization, nothing wrong with that. It is only privatization if it is done in a way that there are no interests of individual. The government has no interest in it. People are coming to say, okay, we are interested in keying into the private sector, for instance, the electricity sector or the energy sector, or the oil and gas sector, and then the government own it, and they should open it to privatization. But that privatization process should be accountable and should be transparent. Not that individual, those people who are close to power. I'm close to the president, and that is why I own this particular sector of the economy in the name of privatization. We have seen that in Nigeria, in the electric or energy sector, I mean electricity sector, we have seen it When Obasanjo began the privatization process, most of those privatizations are owned by individuals who are loyal to the president, and that is what we don't like. And that will continue to, continue to bring a lot of inequality, in our society. But if privatization is done in such a way that it will provide, in such a way that it is very transparent, there are accountability process in it, I think it will go in a long way in providing jobs to our teeming youth across the African countries.
So your concern is that a lot of the privatization efforts have resulted in people entering into the economic sphere of our countries, being loyal to or controlled by the authorities. But one of the things that you hovered around but didn't actually say is the strength of our institutions then remains important. So where do we start? Do we start with the institutions, or do we start with making sure that the people that have access to privatization, or are we against privatization altogether? Because there are instances where there have been massive lobbies against privatization. For instance, in South Africa, massive lobbies against the privatization of South African Airways, against Eskom, resulting in those not being followed through in some cases in other countries as well. So where do we put ourselves in terms of the next call to action, or the next action point rather?
Yeah, I think it has to do with the institution. If the institution in Africa is very strong, nobody is above the institution. There are rule of law, there are accountability. If
Is
we have,
it?
I
Is it?
mean, if there is,
Okay.
if, for instance, there is accountability in Africa,
Mhm.
if leaders can be held accountable to their commitment, and all the process are very open to everybody. So it has to do with the institution. The institution is weak, and that is why everybody is getting away with their action. If the institutions are very strong, for example, anti-corruption institution in our country in Africa are only chasing people who are loyal, who are not loyal to maybe the sitting president. And that is exactly what they are doing. We cannot be able to achieve sufficient economic growth when we don't have anti-corruption that is not biased, that is not partial, that can go after any politicians who may be accused of corruption. And of course, our rule of law and our judicial system. How strong are these institutions in our country in Africa? So we need to have a very strong institution. Institution is very, very important for our growth and development in our country. Individual, no matter how strong you are, the institution is above you. And if you are coming as a president, you must be accountable to the people of Nigeria. You must be accountable to the people of South Africa. You must be, as a president of Ghana, you are accountable to the people of Ghana. These are the people who went and vote for you to go into that particular office. So you need to be accountable to them. And that is why the institution is very important. We need to strengthen our institution so that it can be able to hold each and everyone, no matter your position, accountable to your commitment.
Absolutely. And just piggybacking off of that, Irma, I'm going to ask you something based on what you said, the 3 points or the opportunities that you gave around rethinking engagement. There's a point in the chat from Ahmed that speaks to the need to move beyond symbolic inclusion for young people, and that representation at critical tables is important. Of course, this is opening up another can of worms of, are young people fit to run? Are young people fit to take office? But that's not where we're going with this. We are talking about rethinking engagement when it comes to holding our institutions accountable. And I'm going to, for the benefit of our audience, reiterate what you said. You spoke about recognition being a legitimate civic engagement conversation, especially within the digital space, linking the online engagements with offline policy, as well as protection around digital literacy and the legal. How can the digital space both amplify and solidify this rethinking of engagement when it comes to strengthening our institutions? Emma? Yes, you're not
Sorry,
muted.
I think I lost your question.
Okay, my question was based on the three aspects of the opportunities that you gave us earlier. How can young people and the digital space be catalysts for strengthening our institutions? Is there an opportunity there?
Yes, absolutely. Just
Are you with us? Can you hear us? Okay, I think we've lost Irma there, but this is something I guess all of us must take forward as a critical thinking point when moving forward in engaging with these conversations. I would like to call people to be lobbyists. I would like to call people to really think about the conversations that we've had today. And I would like to thank our, oh, are you back with us, Irma, for a quick 2-second, well, maybe not 2 seconds, but a 20-second intervention, because I think I owe you that after asking the question. 20 seconds.
Firstly, I wanted to chime in on the conversation that was being had, the previous question and comment around privatization. I think it's important for us to ask, why are governments choosing to privatize this particular institutions? We need to also see how the neoliberalism policies are disproportionately affecting the marginalized, which is women and youth in this aspect, and how are we going to reject these policies because we can see that this is in form of borrowing. The reasons why this is coming about is through different countries and the borrowing that they have within the IMF and World Bank. So how do we fix the institutions in terms of corruption and synthesizing it down to privatization is not a bad thing, but if it is not, if the channels and the frameworks are not necessarily being guided, the citizens will not be able to utilize these services in the right way. To your question on how do we excuse me, the three opportunities that I mentioned, being able to bridge that link between the offline and online mobilization. The young people can engage through youth consultations, and particularly within the civic tech platforms, we have a variety of very many youth organizations being supported by different national and regional institutions that are being able to develop platforms for these kinds of engagements. So we can see that for particularly within Kenya, with the Gen Z opportunities that they have to engage, we are seeing that this is an avenue that we'll be able to strengthen. There is now a niche, and the young people actually want to get involved. So we need to be able to strengthen some of these platforms, strengthen these institutions so that they can rely on civil society organizations. I remember during the protests that were happening, and we'd have different engagements, and people from different countries would come and ask, you're a youth organization, what do these young people want? And I am unable to answer that question because I cannot speak on their behalf. So it means that the youth of today do not find these institutions sustainable or strong enough to speak to their issues. And that makes us want to reflect as civil society, what are we not doing? Why can't they rely on us to continue to engage with them civically and to push for the different agendas that they have?
Absolutely. And this, the shrinking of the civic space rather has a bearing, or is reflective rather, of so much that is going on globally, continentally at the present moment. But I would like to thank everybody for joining. I would like to thank our incredible panelists for sharing such powerful insights. And I would love to thank Afrobarometer and the MasterCard Foundation for facilitating this conversation. These conversations are ongoing offline. Even though today we've heard how African youth are not only naming their priorities, but also pointing us towards the gaps that persists and the opportunities that we must seize. I think if there's one clear takeaway, it's that the African youth, as we've been saying for a very long time, are not just the future. And there is a challenge to policymakers, institutions, and communities to match the energy that they bring, the insights that they bring to action, investments, and trust. Thank you once again to Afrobarometer. Thank you once again to the MasterCard Foundation. Thank you once again to the panelists. And thank you once again to everyone for joining. There will be updates coming up from the Afrobarometer and the MasterCard Foundation in the coming days. There will be a press release that includes the data that was presented at the beginning of the webinar, and the news release and insights will be made available to you online as well. Thank you so much once again, and let's keep the momentum beyond today's conversation. Thank you so much.